origins and rise of Mao. Mao Zedong's rise to power came during a time when China was severely politically unstable. Early 20th century China lacked the unity among its people and was essentially set up for violence to occur between the radically different ideologies that were brewing at the time. The government had been established in 1912 did not help stop the spread of warlordism. So much of China was dominated by individual warlords who would pillage villages and murder many civilians. During the Chinese Civil War between the fascist GMD and the communist CCP, Mao had become undisputed leader of the communists after he had led the Long March in 1934 to 1935, which went underway in the interest of retreating to more stable positions where the communists could regroup and regain strength. Even though many were lost along the way, the Red Army's size went from 86,000 in 1934 to 7,000 in 1935, an interesting concept that set Mao apart from mainstream Marxist and communist thinking, the importance of the involvement of the peasants in the revolution. Against the word of Comintern, Mao insisted that the Red Army treat peasants with respect and involve them more with communist revolution. On the same thing, Mao insisted and everyone in the Red Army received the basic provisions such as food and water, and was adamant that everyone would share the hardships of the ordinary man, including officers and those higher up in the military hierarchy. Though the Red Army's lack of equipment in comparison to Zhang's nationalist forces forced the communists into using guerrilla tactics and strategic retreats where troops would choose to retreat in certain situations in order to gain better tactical positions in relation to the enemy. Ironically, though, these tactics were a major part of the reason for the communist victory in the Civil War, as even though the communists lacked the same firepower and manpower as the nationalists, the communists were able to outlast the enemy with their hit-and-run tactics. Eventual victory of the CCP over the GMD hence assured the rise of Mao as the leader of China, since Zhang's retreated to what is now Taiwan to claim it as a true set of Chinese government. Following the communist victory and the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, those that were suspected of the disloyalty to Mao were purged, leading to the strict fear tactics that kept those under Mao loyal to him. Mussolini's origins and rise. Mussolini's rise first started with Italy's weak governing system. This was first seen after the unification of Italy. Italian politics were dominated by liberals who hoped to modernize Italy through social reforms, often in an attempt to eradicate the Catholic power in the state. The liberals were divided between conservative and progressives. However, they stood against the socialists, anarchists, and republicans on the left and the Catholic Church on the right. All these groups were opposed to the new Italian state, and the Risorgimento is the rebirth of Italy after 1815 and was used to represent the fight against division in Italy's state, foreign domination, and called for political unification. This term often brought hope to Italian people, as it was meant change was going to occur. Because of the land and the geography, communication was difficult between the 38 million people in Italy. It was also led to regional alliances rather than allegiance to the nationalist government. Also, there was a split in North and South, as southern states were more industrialized and developed, while southern states were more agriculturally based. The Rigorismo was soon viewed as not complete, as land known as terra irredenta, unredeemed land, had not been reclaimed by the Italian government. Also, they believed that they should follow in the footsteps of Germany's as to establish colonies in Africa and Asia, showing the influence and the causation of Germany's actions over the developing Italy in the late 1800s. Also, many nationalists were angry about Italy's lack of military prowess, which was shown in the death of Abyssinian battle in 1896. This was also seen in Italy's involvement in the First World War. Italy was originally part of the Triple Alliance in the beginning of World War I. However, many socialists felt that it was necessary to remain neutral. This angered many nationalists, as they believed that Italy would reap more benefits from being involved in the war. It wasn't until March 1915 when Italy signed the Treaty of London, which promised Italy land and the result of victory. Also put Italy on the side of the Triple Entente. In the war, the military leadership was poor, and Italy used an incredible amount of resources, as often thousands of men's lives were sacrificed by Italian officers unnecessarily. After the war was through, it had severe economic impact, as it led to heavy borrowing from other nations and inflation. Inflation rose to 400% in 1915 through 1918. The South lost many workers and agriculture due to the conscriptions taking so many people, and in an attempt to limit the attraction of socialism and the ideology of the Russian Bolsheviks, the government promised a program of land reform after the war. Italy was originally promised the land in the Treaty of London, however, it was not received, and this was shown on the map to the left. This led to anger in the state as people demanded the government to take what was promised, and an example being Arditi officers who hated the liberal government because they felt as if they had been betrayed by the Italian people, as they did not receive their demands from the Treaty of London. Mussolini was a part of this group, and in March 1919 he wanted to join the nationalists and the socialists. While Mussolini had not acquired a huge reputation, others carried out the work of nationalists such as Gabriele de Annunzio. The band with an army of 2,000 took the city of Fiume. It was causation for Mussolini to use theoretical trappings used by D'Annunzio, especially the black shirts of Arditi and ancient Roman salute they used. In October 1922, Mussolini marched into Rome demanding power from the king and the prime minister. The king declared the state of emergency. However, when confronted with the option of arresting Mussolini, the king refused and instead allowed Mussolini to take the role of prime minister. The reason being is still unknown, however, speculated by historians today that it was in fear of approaching loss that the king foreshadowed. In both the rises and origins of Mao and Mussolini, strong ideological divisions were in each country, with divisions between regions particularly strong. Both built strong followings. Mussolini had the cult of El Duce, which exemplifies the personal dictatorship that Mussolini was able to establish, and the Long March, which exemplifies Mao's charisma and his ability to persuade people, specifically peasants. Mao placed a higher emphasis on the role of women in the revolution, whereas Mussolini, continuity of Nazi Germany, enforced a more traditional role for women. Violence was the main driving force of the revolution of both Mussolini and Mao. In Mao's case, the victory of the communists in the Civil War helped to solidify his position as ruler of China, whereas in Italy, Mussolini had manipulated the legal political system to rise in a rank of power.
Mao's ideology was largely shaped by those who taught him. In particular, his study under Chiang Kai and Dazhao, as well as his family background, influenced Mao's perception of the need for a strong leader for a strong country. Yan Fu solidified this concept for Mao, planting the seeds of the dictatorship that Mao would later proclaim. In Mao's own words, as a result of his teachings, his mind was a curious mixture of ideas of liberalism, democratic reformism, and utopian socialism. Mao's ideology was hence centered on the importance of the peasantry in relation to revolution, instead of the industrial workers being the driven force of revolution, as was the case with Russia. Mao wanted the peasantry to be this force. This ideology was not cohesive with mainstream Marxist thinking and led to some tensions with the USSR. Mao emphasized this two-stage revolution: mass mobilization, voluntarism, continuous revolution, self-criticism, rectification, and the primacy of Mao Zedong thought. In Mao's ideology, it was held that sheer commitment by the Chinese people should be enough to make up for the lack of technological advancement and capital that China faced post-Civil War. While it is clear that China is now an international power in the present, much of this progress was made after Mao's death in 1972. During his reign, however, Mao blamed bourgeois elements, capitalist roaders, and backsliders for China's economic failures. And interestingly, the idea of self-criticism, as so heavily enforced by his ideology, was not applied to himself. Mao was largely hypocritical in this way, as he shifted blame for many of China's failures away from himself. On the other hand, Mussolini's main ideological standpoint was to appeal to the general Italian public in order to gain the support of the majority. Fascism as a concept was first originated from the 19th century, and Mussolini expanded on those ideas greatly. Although fascism is what he is mostly known for, his ideology over time actually varied quite a bit, starting within the roots of revolutionary socialism, then moving on to nationalism, and finally shifting to total fascism. Early in his ruling, he focused more on action rather than the spreading of ideology, so the use of military was used more during that time. In the early 20s, he distanced himself a bit from the early stages of fascism and began to develop the party greatly. He wanted to be a full-on dictator, and in order to do so, he needed to be the only one in power. So he would practice the purging of members of the Italian government in order to make him stand alone in power. Under Mussolini and his fascism, it was important that the power of the Italian state was emphasized, and this included giving more powers to big companies and employers rather than employees. During the 1930s, Mussolini began to make more clear definitions of fascism in light of his fickle ideological choices in the past, and at this point was able to establish a single-leader dictatorship in Italy. Both Mao and Mussolini's ideology majorly contributed to their success and impact on their states. They differed greatly in their steps to this impact, though. A comparison point for each is that they both shifted their ideologies over time, initially using whatever appealed to the people in order to rise to power. Both also took a strikingly strict ideology to consolidate their power in order to sway the people to believe in these perfect dictators. To do so, Mao approached building a reputation in the opposite way of Mussolini. Mao had focused on the attention of others' failures in order to maintain an image of his perfection, whereas Mussolini focused all the attention on himself and proving he was the manliest of men. This in itself is a point of contrast, but also a point of comparison, because they both attempt to keep up an image, however, they do so in very, very different ways.
Another notable aspect to both of these leaders' rules is their establishment and consolidation of their power. For Mao Zedong, he used campaigns and mass movements in order to gain control of the general public of China. Through this, he was able to ensure that he would stay in power and maintain total control. He also wants to assert his dominance outside of China, and this includes the invasion of outlying territories such as Tibet. In order to appeal to the public in terms of policies for his consolidation of rule, he attempted to improve living standards across China's rural and urban areas. Also, on this note, he destroyed wealthy landlords to appeal to the middle and lower class citizens of China. Opposition in China was seen as a threat to Mao, and therefore was eliminated at every cost. Another important aspect to Mao's consolidation of power was the use of propaganda, which was used to convert people to communism and see Mao as the all-knowing leader. There was also a constant barrage on the rightist ideology in order to get people to view communism as the only right way of ruling. Mao saw the army as a tool to get people to obey him, and was used in order to do just that. This would then create a totalitarian state where Mao could control what people think. Mussolini's plan to appeal to the general Italian public allowed for the longevity of his rule and the consolidation of his power. He would also silence any opposition he received in order to make sure he held on to his rule. Mussolini's use of propaganda was meant to increase his general acceptance by the public, which seeped into every aspect of Italian life, including in the school systems where students were taught about fascist ideology. Army was used for expansion, wanting to assert dominance as a world power to keep his promises to the Italians through the annexation of Ethiopia, furthering his consolidation of his rule. After gaining the support from Italian nationalist citizens, Mussolini started to look for support from the Catholic Church in order to gain from the benefits of having such an influential power on his side. Mussolini also banned trade unions, which would help bring him closer to being a single-party state dictator, furthered by repression and censorship, as well as the abolishment of local governments. Mussolini finally enters World War II, but perhaps a bit prematurely, and received much disagreement from the general Italian public, which eventually led to his fall. Now, to compare these two rulers, first we will look at how they are similar in terms of propaganda. Their perspectives on ruling tactics allow them to have similar viewpoints on propaganda, which include general censorship of press and media in order to control public ideology. Taking a look at their general methods of ruling, they contrast a bit because for Mao, he wants more of a strict and total obedience from his people, while Mussolini is more focused on seeking to gain trust and support from the general Italian public without such extreme methods that are used by Mao. Their viewpoint on army usage is also quite similar. Both wanted to use their armies as a show of force and strength, specifically in outlying territories, as well as attempts at annexation in order to expand their empire and increase their status as a world power. Speaking in terms of relationships, Mao was an extreme isolationist and didn't want support from anyone else besides the communists, while Mussolini took a more practical approach to the situation and saw that his power would strengthen with the support of other parties such as the Roman Catholic Church, and sought to make good relationships with them.
During Mao's reign, great emphasis was placed on the need to propel China to an international power. Mao believed that his strand of Chinese Marxism would help this, and in an interesting move, Mao instated national capitalism to ease into the transition into full nationalization of business. Though, the period shortly after this, with the Great Leap Forward, brought some resentment from the peasants. The Cultural Revolution of 1966 further displaced the Chinese economy, which had been somewhat put back on track by Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. In addition, Mao's policies on women, though progressive on the surface, did not actually enhance the lives of women. Though employment of women increased from 8% to 32%, this meant that women often had to be mothers and work jobs, which decreased the quality of life for many women significantly. Similarly, even though literacy did increase overall under Mao, educational growth was stunted due to governmental condemnation of intellectualism and the Cultural Revolution. This Cultural Revolution led to the deaths of many intellectuals and creative individuals, effectively making its name an oxymoron, as it destroyed much of China's actual culture. In terms of economic policy, Mao believed in the collective ownership of the means of production, in order to forward his vision of making China an international power, surpassing the USSR. Mao hoped to repair the damage done to the Chinese economy due to the Chinese Civil War with radical land reforms, with landlords being tried and executed in many cases, and the redistribution of land to peasants. Similarly, the relatively successful period of national capitalism, though characterized by steady growth and transferal of most heavy industry and banking to the government, ended with the 5-year plan of 1953 and the subsequent Great Leap Forward, which displaced China's economy. For example, even though steel production increased significantly due to the introduction of backyard furnaces to smelt steel, 99% of the steel had to be disposed of because it was unusable. Mussolini's policies were reinforced by the concept of the Third Way of fascism, combining nationalism, state-controlled business, echoes of the Roman Empire, and hopes of utopia. To this end, Mussolini executed various battles, meant to improve very specific areas of society by pinpointing them one at a time. Such battles included the Battle for Bourse, Battle for Grain, and the Battle for Lira, Italy's form of currency. All of these battles were undertaken in the interest of autarky, or complete economic self-sufficiency. Mussolini enforced many policies that discouraged international trade, except for that of raw materials, in order to decrease Italy's reliance on other countries. This policy was most likely a result of Mussolini's intention to keep Italy self-sustained in case it had to break ties with such important allies as Germany. Though these battles were mostly unsuccessful due to the lack of consistency in their execution. In addition to this, Mussolini also emphasized the importance of traditional roles for women, anti-Semitism, and Roman Catholicism as a standard in education. In terms of policy, both leaders held autarky as a main goal for their respective economies, though Mussolini to a greater extent. In particular, Mussolini had used many different battles as a method of achieving this autarky, whereas Mao used larger movements like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. In this way, Mao was somewhat more organized in the execution of his policies, which is reflected in the longevity of his regime. In addition, though Mao denounced religion as one of the four olds, Mussolini came to embrace Catholicism as a way of teaching obedience in schools and gaining the support of the papacy, even though Mussolini himself was somewhat anti-religious. Furthermore, both dictators used manipulation of the public to great effect, each using propaganda and their respective cults as methods of persuading the public, though Mao used visual propaganda to a greater extent than Mussolini, who emphasized the use of speeches and parades. In addition, both leaders indoctrinated their respective youth with Mussolini's Opera Nazionale Balilla and Mao's Cultural Revolution. Taking all of this into consideration, the following answer can be given to the key question at hand. When comparing Mao to Mussolini, the theme of domestic policies and their impact is most significant in understanding the impact of single-party state rulers in the 20th century, particularly because in the case of Mao and Mussolini, it is more important to consider the long-term effects of each respective regime rather than the origins, nature, or establishment thereof. To understand the impact of these rulers, the domestic and international effects, such as those of the aforementioned Cultural Revolution, must be considered, and under any of the themes which do not consider domestic policies and their impact, these effects will not be fully understood.